presenter today is going to be introduced by his faculty advisor, John Jefferson.
Okay. Adam Kopp is giving us a completion seminar today. Adam came to SDSU from Wayne State College in Nebraska. He worked as a technician on an elk project that I had in Black Hills, and then worked for me on a deer project in Perkins County for a while before starting this Pronghorn project that he's going to talk about today. And this is the conclusion of his master's work. So with that, I'll turn it over to Adam.
All right. Do I need to hit these lights a little bit?
How do we lower them?
Should I hit these lights real quick?
I should learn.
The one closest to the wall.
That one?
Yeah, closest to the back wall. They're in order.
Okay, that works.
Is that better? Is that good?
Yeah, I think that works. Well, thanks everybody for coming today. And as I talk about my research on pronghorn in western South Dakota, I'm specifically going to be talking about more or less the population vital rates type of data that South Dakota Game Fish and Parks utilizes for modeling and managing pronghorn populations in South Dakota. So in this case, that's going to be dealing with the survival and sightability aspects of my research. So if we consider historical populations of pronghorn prior to European American settlement, there was probably estimates of anywhere about 40 to 50 million animals throughout western North America. However, as people started to settle the West, we saw dramatic declines during the 1800s due to overhunting and habitat loss. And so much by the 1920s, there was only an estimated 13,000 pronghorn distributed throughout that original range. And when we consider South Dakota, that probably historically had a population of about 700,000 pronghorn throughout the entire state. By 1924, there was only about 700 pronghorn remaining in west central South Dakota. And when we consider the significance of that population in west central South Dakota, aside from being the region where I would conduct my research, that population was used to reestablish other pronghorn populations throughout western South Dakota, as kind of illustrated by this map, the star indicating where that original population was. And then we saw translocations of individuals during the 1950s, I believe, to Hardin County, Custer, Tripp, and Jackson. And consequently, today there's about 48,000 pronghorn in South Dakota. And that's geographically about the 5th largest population in North America. And as I mentioned, South Dakota Game Fish and Parks is that primary agency responsible for managing pronghorn populations in the state. And as an objective, they're trying to manage for about 68,000 pronghorn. So when you consider the population, the trends and estimates over the last 80 years, dating back to 1941 when they started estimating abundance, you can really see these fluctuations up and down in population size. So it really reiterates the importance of having sound biological data in order to effectively manage these populations, especially since game fish really use hunting as a primary management tool. And so how do they do that and monitor these populations is through that within population vital rates that include looking at survival, estimating abundance, and then understanding reproduction and how that may have an effect on population growth on a year-to-year basis. And how they acquire that information is largely through management surveys, and that might include hunter-harvest surveys where they're trying to get input back from hunters during a given season, understand what their success rate is. Two, from fall recruitment surveys where they're trying to understand fawn-doe ratios and sex ratios, to how that might influence recruitment and population growth. And then obviously spring aerial surveys where they're trying to estimate abundance. And when we consider this even further prior to our study, in 2013, GF&P documented a low of 59 fawns per 100 does during their fall classification surveys. And when we consider that to the previous 10-year weighted average of 85 fawns per 100 does, that's substantially lower So as an agency, they're kind of wondering what's influencing that low recruitment, and more specifically, what kind of impact or influence do coyotes have on pronghorn survival, particularly neonates, after a period when coyote populations may have been lower due to sarcoptic mange. And then when it comes to measuring abundance through GFMP's spring aerial surveys, even for a species like pronghorn that are out in the open, they shouldn't be hiding under trees, they shouldn't be hiding in dense vegetation, it's relatively impossible to detect all pronghorn during a given survey. And that's kind of illustrated by previous research that have looked at estimating pronghorn populations where detectability can be as low as 50%. And so to really counteract that visibility bias associated with estimating abundance, we rely on sightability models to account for, and that includes looking at factors that influence detectability, and that might be intrinsic, such as group size or animal behavior, or extrinsic, such as cover type or topography, all factors that influence the surveyor's ability to detect all the pronghorn in a certain region. So our objectives were to, one, provide estimates or estimates of survival and cause-specific mortality for pronghorn in western South Dakota, and that included looking at adult yearlings and fawns that are all specific age cohorts within the population that in some way influence population growth on a year-to-year basis. And then two, develop a sightability model that really confines to the methodology in which South Dakota Game Fish and Parks implements their spring aerial surveys for estimating abundance. So as I mentioned, we chose western South Dakota as our study area, and we chose, it was mainly focused in Butte County, but also included parts of Harding, Perkins, and Meade County, and that was about roughly an area of 7,000 square kilometers in size. And when we look at the vegetation and habitat characteristics of our study area, it is mainly dominated by grassland, which is primarily used for livestock production in western South Dakota. However, we also did have a little bit of shrubland in terms of sagebrush and cropland that was primarily made up of alfalfa, hay, and winter wheat fields. So to really make this project a project and work, we had to put radio collars on pronghorn. And we used a wildlife capture company, Quicksilver Air, and they use helicopter net gunning techniques to capture both adult and yearling female pronghorn for us. They fit those individuals with VHF negative radio collars, took a blood sample. And in order to minimize stress on those individuals and potential capture myopathy, we handled and released those at the location of which they were captured. Similarly, putting collars on fawns, we hand captured 1 to 7-day-old neonates using binocular and long fishing pole net type techniques. Fit those individuals with expansion breakaway VHF radio collars that allowed the collar to expand as the fawn grew and matured in age. And when we captured them, we just determined whether or not they were male or female, took a weight, and estimated their age. We tracked adults and yearlings 1 to 3 times per week, and fawns daily for 9 weeks post-capture. And that's simply because we expect fawns to be more susceptible to mortality, particularly coyote predation when they're in that hiding phase. And then it was 2 to 3 times a week per after. We use Kaplan-Meier procedure modified for staggered entry and program mark for our survival analysis, where we looked at survival from a monthly point of view for fawns, as well as seasonal and annual survival rates. So for our sightability survey designs, we used a Cessna 172 fixed-wing aircraft, flew our surveys during the spring to coincide with the green up, and transects were predetermined prior to each survey based on locations of radio-collared pronghorn. So the concept was that we would fly the plane at 125 kilometers per hour and maintain an altitude of 60 meters above the ground, above the transect. And the plane would fly in north and south fashion at 800 meters apart transects. We had 2 observers in the front seat of the plane, and their objective was to count all pronghorn groups within 400 meters of the transect. There was also a non-observer, myself, in the back seat of the plane, and I was equipped with radio telemetry equipment, and I was the only one capable of determining whether or not a group of pronghorn had a radio-collared individual in it or not. So regardless if a group of pronghorn with a radio-collared individual was detected or not by our observers, we then took a GPS location for that group's location and then measured coefficients, sightability coefficients that may affect visibility, detection visibility. And so that included continuous coefficients such as group size, which was any number of individuals greater than or equal to 1, and topography, which we calculated from the GPS location that we took as a terrain ruggedness index in ArcGIS. And then we also look at that coefficient, categorical coefficients such as behavior, cover type, and landscape background. And in terms of background, we classified that as green, brown, or a combination. And a combination is was supposed to represent a more heterogeneous type background in terms of where the pronghorn group was located, where there might be a combination of green vegetation and bare soil. So when we look at our overall adult survival rates, we had overall pretty high survival for adults at 87%, and that was comparable during both years of our study in 2015 and 16, as well as being comparable to other research projects that had examined adult survival at Wind Cave National Park, Harding County, and Fall River County. And when we look at adult cause-specific mortality for those adults, for those few instances where we did have mortality, that included unknown, harvest, predation. We did have a couple of capture myopathies, and those individuals were censored prior to our survival analysis. Yearling survival was a little lower at 78% during both years of our study, pretty comparable. It was a little lower than that documented in Harding and Fall River County. However, the data that was available only was from November to April. We were actually a whole year from November to November, so it's not hard to believe that if that data would have been available and extended to November, that these survival rates may have dropped a little bit potentially. But when we look at cause-specific mortality, we had 5 individuals that were in fact still killed by coyotes. So it really kind of reiterates the fact that even though these yearlings are a little older, they're not fawns anymore, there's still a certain degree of susceptibility to coyote predation. And then when we look at fawn survival, we had an overall survival of 66% during both years of our study. And when we look at summer survival rates and compare that to other research conducted in the early 2000s, we were substantially higher than Wind Cave National Park and somewhat intermediate to Harding and Fall River County. We look at predation and cause-specific mortality. Predation was in form of coyotes, was the leading cause of mortality in fawns at 15. But we also had 11 unknown mortalities, and I just threw this in there because we know those individuals weren't killed by coyotes or any other form of predation. They were just whole carcasses that we had found. And so we sampled them and had them looked at the lab, and it still kind of came back inconclusive for us, so we're still kind of left scratching our head, and a little bit more to be desired in terms of knowing exactly what influences fawn mortality. And then for our sightability analysis and results, we conducted 9 surveys over both years of our study, documented 235 group observations based on radio-collared pronghorn for an overall detection probability of 86%. And this is just a table to illustrate the detection probabilities for those specific coefficients that we looked at, including group size all the way down to background. And even though I have it listed as a categorical variable for group size and topography, that was just to kind of have a visual aspect. It's really that we did measure them as continuous in our model development and our analysis. But when we ran a stepwise regression, 85% confidence intervals to determine which variables were best at explaining the data for pronghorn detectability, group size, topography, and background were those coefficients that best explain the data. And that kind of makes sense because when you look at a cover type or a variable such as cover type, even though we had 67% detectability, and that's lower than 87%, we didn't have a whole lot of observations in these habitat types. So when 90% of your observations are in here, it makes sense that this isn't going to be a significant or an important variable. And then real quick, because we'll probably get to it later, for when we look at some other variables such as background, we didn't see much difference in detectability between brown and green, but we did see about almost a 15% drop when it came to that more heterogeneous environment. So when we ran logistic regression analysis using the GLM function in R for developing our model selection based on AIC modeling, we determined that the top model that best explained the data included group size, background, and topography. However, when we look at those delta AIC and weights, there really wasn't much of a difference between the model 1 and 2 in terms of being the best model. And even when that's even considered further when we look at relative variable importance, topography, background, still pretty important, group size not so much. But when we compare that and understand other research projects that have found group size to be a very important factor in pronghorn and other wildlife species detectability, we decided to leave that in there in terms of our model development in order not to underfit and leave out an important variable that does explain detectability. And so when we look at those parameter estimates and odds ratios, we see that the odds or the chances of detecting pronghorn increased with group size as that increased. It also increased as topography became more flatter. And then we were half as likely, almost half as likely to detect pronghorn in a heterogeneous environment compared to a more homogeneous or brown or green background. So overall, we had really high adult survival rates that were comparable to other research that has documented in North and South Dakota, around at 85 and 95% survival. However, we did document some geographical differences in fawn survival rates compared to other projects in South Dakota, but coyote predation is that primary factor that does influence fawn mortality. And as from a research point of view, well, how does that mean in terms of how this population is potentially growing? Well, based on Phillips and White, who indicated that when neonate survival is less than or equal to 25%, there's less than a 5% chance for population growth. And well, we're well above that threshold, so at least during our time of our study and our results, we should expect that our population to be growing. And then when we look at sightability models and compare that to those developed in the early 2000s, specifically with Jakes, who looked at pronghorn sightability in South Dakota, he determined that group size, behavior, and percent vegetation were important variables in predicting pronghorn detectability. And when it comes to group size, we still included that in our model selection. However, it wasn't that important of a variable during our study compared to his, and we contribute that probably just to a low sample size. But when we look at behavior, where it was an important variable in his model and not ours, that may have been contributed somewhat to differences in survey methodology. And to kind of explain that, we flew our aircraft on our transects at about 50 or 60 meters above the ground, and he was almost twice that height and elevation, or at about 100 meters. So if you can imagine a group of pronghorn that's potentially bedded, and they see a low-flying aircraft coming at them, they're probably going to get up and move before our observers were able to actually see them actually bedded. So it may have been just a product of different methodology influencing animal behavior, and that's why it didn't come out as an important variable. And then when we look at percent vegetation, he had indicated that with increased percent vegetation, it also resulted in increased detectability. And he had mentioned in his paper, when you look at a heterogeneous versus homogeneous landscape characteristics, those more uniform landscapes help maximize the color contrast of the pronghorn with its background. And that was similar to us. So when you have a pronghorn that's in a more uniform landscape, the observers were able to see those pronghorn at a higher rate. So overall, our data provides additional information for South Dakota game fish and parks when it comes to managing and modeling populations for pronghorn in the state. And additionally, it's providing the sightability model for estimating abundance. And that's key for making management decisions, including harvest regulations, the number of tags that they should allocate during a given year, as well as understanding the influence that natural and anthropogenic factors may have on population growth during a given year. So with that, I want to thank my technicians, all the landowners of western South Dakota, the pilots who flew me around my study area and helped during my sightability model. South Dakota Game Fish and Parks employee with captures and all my sightability surveys, federal aid, and of course Dr. Jonathan Jenks. And with that, I will take questions. Yes.
Is there a predator control happening in Hardin County?
Yeah, predator control is a big thing that happens pretty much all throughout western South Dakota. It's primarily used for livestock depredation, but yeah, there's quite a bit.
Will that have some influence on the higher survival in Hardin County?
Yes, most likely, yeah. In terms of predator control up there, it's pretty extensive, and that was something that Jakes had mentioned in his paper, that lower densities in coyotes may contribute to a higher survival rate for ponds. Yes.
So what are your specific management recommendations that you shared with Game Fish and Parks?
Well, they were a big influence in this, and they were kind of every step of the way. And this is really how they, in terms of collaborating with them and developing our sightability model. So they should be able to take all this information that they applied and use it for their estimates for estimating abundance when it comes to their spring aerial surveys for pronghorn.
So do you recommend the 60-meter height?
Yeah, well,
100-meter. I'm just curious about that because that was an interesting.
Well, that was part of the reason why we looked at developing a sightability model, is because based on their management protocol, that's the altitude they applied their plane during their survey. So we matched it exactly how they would conduct their surveys so that they could actually use our sightability model. Yep.
Early on in the presentation, you showed a population graph with population data over time, and it looked like there's definitely a phase of that recovery from the excessive hunting in the early part of the 20th century, and then it kind of goes into this much more cyclical like phase.
Yep.
Do you guys know what's going on there?
That's largely influenced by severe winters.
Really?
Yeah, so you get these really harsh winters, even though the population rebounded back up to their objective, and then it just starts to decline again, just because. And you might assume that some of that is probably involved with direct mortality where individuals die, but some of it you would almost expect that even individuals are leaving the area and it just takes them a while to come back. But that's the biggest reason why we see these ups and down fluctuations in populations, because of severe winters.
Thanks.
Yep.
So this is a relic population that never went extinct in South Dakota. Why do you think that is? You know, now you spent 2 years crossing that terrain there. Yeah. And considering that the entire rest of South Dakota, pronghorn were hunted to extinction except for this one population. Why is that? Do you have any idea?
I really don't know if I could answer that, the reason for that.
Is there something about the topography that makes it unique? The river systems, anything that you think of?
I'm not sure if it's necessarily higher quality habitat, especially when you compare it to Hardin County that really didn't have that relic population, because there's pretty high quality habitat in that region too. So in terms of what actually influenced why that population survived compared to other regions, just luck, chance maybe. I don't know. I'm not sure if I can really answer that. I mean, I don't know if you know, or
I'm not sharing. It's not my seminar.
Well, I'll look into that and make sure that maybe I can find a reason for that.
Yep. I just have a question. So really, you've documented a procedure of how to do this assessment. I keep waiting for a model. But you're not doing modeling, right? It's a how-to. What are the best practices for monitoring the population? Is that correct?
Well, no, it's a model for estimating population size.
So explain the modeling component to me.
Okay. Let me see if I can get to it right. So this was our top model that we developed based on AIC modeling.
Right, I understand that, but that's an analysis of your data.
So when GFP does this, all they have to do is go back, count their groups, apply this to measure these variables in terms of group size, topography, background, and then apply that to their model for estimating detectability. And then that'll account for the number of pronghorn that's potentially being missed to estimate abundance for the entire state.
So you've decided, so you have determined what metrics should be in any model when they analyze their data?
Yes.
Okay, got it.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, I understand. Other questions? Can I ask one more?
Sure.
Why do they think they can manage a population of 68,000 when we have 48,000? Adam, how do they come up with that? I guess I'm curious.
I'm a little curious on that too, given that really they have to really base it off of carrying capacities and what they think is most appropriate. And that might fluctuate on a year-to-year basis based on landowner tolerance as well and what they think the population can be supported in terms of quality habitat. So, but yeah, it seems to be a generic number that they've chosen.
Is it related to the table that Josh had you go back to in terms of numbers? I was just curious.
The population size
Yeah,
estimates?
I was just
But it looks
curious
like they
if
have
there
a
were
confidence
crashes.
interval around their estimate.
Yeah,
so-
plus or minus 10,000. So
Yeah.
Plus or minus 10. Okay, so they're not so far off. Oh, there it is. So then 68. So they're saying it peaks out. Yeah, it is related to it. Okay. I get it, because I see your objective there at 70K. So because then they see the crashes after that. So it could be overwintering and lack of food, right?
it's possible.
Correct, because you're
It's actually
peaking.
gonna be landowner tolerance.
Really?
The landowners out in the west, when they get a bunch of pronghorn on their property, when you get up to that 85,000 pronghorn, there's so much degradation that they complain to the state, and at that time they want population reduced. What the state's trying to do here is predict when that's gonna happen, so they can increase tech to keep that population at a desired level for landowners, but yet maximize the opportunity for hunters at the same time.
Right, by maintaining the viability of the population, right? Okay, thank you. Okay. Any more questions? All right, let's thank Adam one more time.